How Mossad hunted the financial brain behind a regional terror wave. The humidity in Tel Aviv has a way of clinging to everything like a second skin. But inside the basement of the glass house, the air is perpetually dry and smells of ozone and old paper. David sat at a desk that hadn't been cleared in 3 weeks, staring at a ledger recovered from a saturated tunnel in Khan Yunis. The pages were bloated with moisture, and the ink had bled into purple bruises, but the numbers remained stubbornly legible. These were not the poetic manifestos of a revolutionary or the tactical maps of a guerrilla commander. These were balance sheets. In the world of high-stakes intelligence, the greatest secrets are rarely whispered in dark alleys. They are buried in the sterile columns of a spreadsheet. David traced a finger over a recurring entry marked simply as Ramadan. It was a name that appeared next to figures that would make a mid-sized European bank envious. Tens of millions of dollars flowing like water through a sieve, yet leaving no trace on the surface of the global financial system. To the world, this was invisible money. To the Mossad, it was the oxygen of a regional nightmare. The city of Qum is a place of shadows and shrines, where the air is thick with the scent of incense and the weight of ancient theology. It is also where the world's most dangerous accountant kept his books. Saeed Izadi did not look like a man who held the keys to a regional conflagration.
He was a man of modest habits, a middle-level bureaucrat in the vast machinery of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. He lived in a residential apartment that smelled of saffron and strong tea. He walked the same route to his office every morning, stopping for bread at a local bakery, and nodding politely to neighbours who knew him only as a quiet civil servant. But behind that mask of grey anonymity, Izadi was the architect of Project Tufan. He was the bridge between the marble halls of Tehran and the concrete bunkers of Gaza and Beirut. He didn't carry a rifle. He carried an encrypted laptop and a list of shell companies that stretched from the ports of Turkey to the shopping districts of Dubai. In the early months of the investigation, the trail was cold. The money didn't move through SWIFT codes or digital transfers that could be flagged by the Treasury. It moved through the Hawala, a system older than the banks themselves, built on trust and handshakes. A merchant in Istanbul would receive a shipment of textiles and a phone call. A week later, a money changer in a dusty Gaza market would hand over a suitcase of cash. There was no paper trail, only the silent movement of value across borders. David and his team at the Harpoon Division spent 18 hours a day mapping these ghosts. They watched the price of gold in Ankara. They tracked the sudden wealth of obscure real estate developers in Algeria.
They looked for the mistake, the tiny ripple in the water that proves something is moving beneath the surface. The breakthrough came from a discarded receipt found in the pocket of a courier detained at the border. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a dry cleaning tag from a high-end hotel in Istanbul. The name on the tag was an alias, but the dates coincided perfectly with a $20 million surge in the accounts of a Hamas front company. The Mossad doesn't believe in coincidences. They believe in patterns. They began to pull on the thread, and the tapestry began to unravel. The man in the hotel wasn't a terrorist. He was a financial facilitator working for Izadi. He was the one who managed the Turkey network, exploiting legitimate financial infrastructure to move the blood money of the Quds force. The intelligence began to solidify. Izadi wasn't just sending money, he was managing a portfolio. He was reprimanding commanders for operational waste. He was the one who decided which tunnels were built and which rockets were bought. The tension in the Harpoon office was of physical weight. They were no longer looking at a screen, they were looking at a man. They watched Izadi through the eyes of assets on the ground and the unblinking stare of satellites. They saw him meet with senior Hamas leadership in the shadows of the European Hospital Command Center via encrypted links.
They watched him coordinate the Tufan 1 project, a $21 million weapons transfer designed to reignite the southern front. Then came Tufan 2, a project so ambitious it threatened to tip the scales of the entire region. The order came from the highest levels, storm of gunfire. It was a sequence of precise decisions made thousands of miles away. In the quiet streets of Qom, the ordinary routine of Saeed Izadi continued. He bought his bread, he walked his route, he felt the security of his own borders and the protection of the regime. He believed he was a ghost, invisible to the censors of his enemies. He didn't know that every dollar he had moved, every shell company he had registered, had been a breadcrumb leading back to his front door. On a Saturday night in June, the silence of Qom was broken by a single sharp report. There were no tanks on the streets, no paratroopers falling from the sky, just a residential apartment in a quiet neighborhood and the sudden cold reality of an intelligence service that never forgets. When the dust settled, the financial heart of the network stopped beating. The ledgers were closed. The shell companies in Turkey suddenly found their accounts frozen by a series of unexplained regulatory failures. The couriers in the Balkans stopped receiving their calls.
The weapons shipments planned under Tufan II remained sitting in crates in a warehouse in Sudan, destined to never reach the hands they were intended for. In the basement of the glass house, David finally closed the bloated ledger. He didn't celebrate. There were no cheers. He simply reached for the next file on his desk. The financial brain was gone, but the machine he built was vast, and its parts were already attempting to reform. The war of the shadows is never truly won. It is only managed one ledger at a time. The world wakes up and goes to work, unaware of the suitcases of cash moving through the markets, or the quiet men in residential apartments who decide the fate of nations with the stroke of a key. The threat is not always a man with a bomb. Sometimes it is a man with a spreadsheet, and as long as the money flows, the hunt continues. The world remains a place of invisible threats and silent consequences, where the most dangerous people are the ones you never see until the moment the books are balanced. The ledger is never truly empty. There is always another name. There is always another Ramadan. The sun rose over Tel Aviv, casting long shadows across the Mediterranean. The city began to wake up, the coffee shops opening their doors, the traffic beginning to hum. People walked to their offices and their schools, never knowing how close the Tufan had come to their shores.
They lived in the light of the ordinary, unaware of the dry air and the ozone of the basement, where the ghosts are mapped. David left the building and walked into the morning heat. He looked at the faces in the crowd, wondering which ones were masks and which ones were real. The world looks the same on the surface, but once you have seen the purple ink of a wet ledger, you can never look at it the same way again. The silence is not peace. It is merely the absence of the next explosion, and in the shadows, the next hunt has already begun. The intelligence gathered from the Khan Yunis tunnels had proven that the Iranian regime's reach was not just ideological, but deeply logistical. Izadi had been the primary conduit for the Quds Force, ensuring that the political and military wings of Hamas never wanted for resources. He had built a system where the collapse of one node did not mean the death of the network. He had used the very globalism that the West championed to fund its destruction. By the time the precision strike occurred in Qom, the Mossad had already mapped the secondary and tertiary facilitators who would attempt to step into the vacuum. This was the true strength of the operation, not the elimination of one man, but the mapping of an entire ecosystem of terror finance. As the news of Izadi's death trickled through the specialized channels of the intelligence community, the reactions were varied.
In Tehran, there was a frantic effort to scrub digital footprints and secure remaining assets. In Ankara, several money changers simply vanished into the backstreets of the Grand Bazaar. In Beirut, a senior Hezbollah financier found his encrypted phone suddenly dead and his access codes revoked. The shockwaves of a single strike in Iran were being felt in the bank vaults of 4 different continents. This was the power of financial warfare. It was the ability to paralyze an enemy without firing a single shot on the battlefield. But for David and his team, the work was far from over. They knew that somewhere another accountant was being briefed.
Somewhere another quiet man was being given the keys to a new set of shell companies. The regional terror wave was not just a series of attacks, but a business model. It was a franchise of violence that required constant capital. The Mossad's job was to make that capital too expensive to move and too dangerous to hold. They were the auditors of a war that had no end date. The files on David's desk were now categorized by the names of the survivors: the Turkey network, the Balkan corridor, the East African smuggling routes. Each one represented a different chapter in a story that began long before Izadi and would continue long after him. The hunt for the financial brain had been a success, but the body of the monster was still twitching. It would take more than one strike to kill the beast.
It would take 1,000 cuts to its bank accounts and 1,000,000 eyes on its ledgers. The night air in Tel Aviv finally began to cool as David walked home. He thought about the apartment in Qom and the man who lived there. He thought about the banality of the evil he had spent years tracking. It wasn't the fiery rhetoric of the mosques that had built the tunnels. It was the quiet, methodical work of a man who understood interest rates and currency fluctuations. The most dangerous enemies are the ones who treat war like a business, and the most effective way to stop them is to make them bankrupt. The street lights flickered to life as he reached his door. The world was still full of invisible threats, hidden in the mundane details of everyday life. A dry cleaning tag, a grocery receipt, a phone call to a merchant in a distant city. These were the weapons of the new century, and as long as there were men like Izadi, there would be men like David watching from the shadows, waiting for the next mistake. The ledger was closed for today, but tomorrow the columns would be full again. The game of shadows is a game of endurance, and the Mossad had no intention of being the first to tire. The investigation into the Turkey network revealed even deeper layers of complicity. It wasn't just small-time money changers.
It was a sophisticated operation that involved receiving, storing and moving Iranian funds through the Turkish financial infrastructure with the silent approval of certain local elements. The operatives were Gaza-born men who had reinvented themselves as successful businessmen in Istanbul. They owned real estate companies, export firms, and tech startups. All of them were facades. All of them were lungs for the Hamas treasury. The IDF and Shin Bet had discovered documents in the underground command centers of Gaza that tied these individuals directly to Izadi. One such operative, Tamer Hassan, had been living a life of luxury in a villa overlooking the Bosphorus. He worked directly under Khalil al-Hayya, but his true master was the ledger in Qom. Hassan was responsible for the day-to-day movements of cash, ensuring that the military wing always had the liquidity it needed for its operations. When the news of Izadi's death reached him, Hassan didn't flee. He didn't have time. Within hours, the accounts he had spent years building were systematically dismantled by a series of coordinated cyber operations and international legal requests. The villa in Istanbul, which had been a symbol of his success, became his prison, as the Turkish authorities, pressured by international intelligence, felt the heat of the spotlight. The ripple effect continued into Europe. A network of affiliated infrastructure was exposed in Germany and the Netherlands.
These weren't cells waiting to attack, but the logistical backbone of the movement. They were the ones who managed the donations from unsuspecting charities, the ones who laundered the proceeds from illicit trades in the Balkans. The Mossad's revelation of this network forced European law enforcement to act. It was no longer a matter of political debate. It was a matter of national security. The invisible web that Izadi had woven was being pulled apart, strand by strand. Yet even with these victories, the sense of unease remained. The collapse of the Izadi network didn't mean the end of the threat. It only meant the threat was changing shape. The Iranian regime had already begun to explore decentralized finance and cryptocurrency as a way to bypass the traditional choke points. The battlefield was shifting from the ledger to the blockchain. The accountants were becoming coders, and the money was becoming even harder to track. But the principles remained the same. Follow the value, and you find the man. David returned to his desk the next morning. The ozone smell was still there, but the room felt different. The weight of the Izadi case had been lifted,
but in its place was the anticipation of what came next. He pulled a new file from the bottom of the stack. It was a report on a series of unusual transactions in Southeast Asia involving a new type of digital wallet. There was no name on the file, only a designation, Ramadan 2.
David looked at the screen and felt the familiar pull of the pattern. The game was starting again. The hunt for the financial brain had shown the world that no boundary could shield those responsible for the atrocities of the regional terror wave. Qom was once considered a sanctuary, a place where the IRGC could operate with impunity. The precision strike had shattered that illusion. It had sent a message that the arm of the Mossad was long and its memory was longer. But the message wasn't just for the enemies in Tehran. It was for the world. It was a reminder that the war of the shadows is fought every day in the most ordinary of places. The world is still full of invisible threats. They are in the bank transfers that look like mortgage payments. They are in the shipping containers that carry more than just textiles. They are in the quiet conversations in the back of coffee shops. The task of the intelligence service is to find the signal in the noise, to find the one truth in a mountain of lies. And as David began to map the new digital trail, he knew that the silence of the city outside was a fragile thing. It was a silence bought with the work of men like him, and the precision of an intelligence that never sleeps. The story of the hunt for Saeed Izadi is not a story of a single day or a single strike. It is a story of years of patient observation and meticulous record-keeping. It is a story of the power of the paper trail and the vulnerability of the accountant.
In the end, Izadi was undone by the very thing that made him powerful, his obsession with the details, his need for order, his belief that he could manage the chaos of war from a spreadsheet. He forgot that every entry has a source, and every source is a vulnerability. The documents found in the European hospital in Khan Yunis had revealed more than just financial transactions. They had revealed the deep psychological connection between the patrons in Tehran and the proxies in Gaza. The correspondence between Mohammed Sinwar and Saeed Izadi showed a relationship built on both fear and dependence. Izadi wasn't just a financier, he was a supervisor. He reprimanded the Hamas commanders for their operational failures and demanded detailed reports on how every dollar was spent. He was the one who imposed the command structures and managed the propaganda strategies. He was the true architect of the regional axis. The Tufan projects were his legacy. Tufan 1 had been a success in its logistical execution, moving tens of millions of dollars worth of weaponry through a complex network of East African and Syrian corridors. Tufan 2 was intended to be the final blow, a massive infusion of resources that would have enabled a second, even larger offensive. The Mossad's intervention didn't just kill a man, it killed a vision. It disrupted the implementation of Qasem Soleimani's dream of a united resistance axis under Iranian leadership.
Without Izadi, the coordination between Hamas, Hezbollah, and the remaining remnants of the Syrian regime began to fray. As the years pass, the name Saeed Izadi may fade from the headlines, but his story remains a blueprint for the modern age of espionage. It is a reminder that the most significant battles are often fought in the silence of an office or the quiet of a residential street. It is a reminder that the world is governed by forces we rarely see, and that the line between order and chaos is thinner than we like to believe. The hunt for the financial brain was a victory for intelligence over brute force, a victory for the patient mapping of the shadows. David walked to the window and looked out at the lights of Tel Aviv. He knew that somewhere out there another ledger was being opened. Somewhere another name was being written in purple ink. The world is full of invisible threats, but it is also full of people who have dedicated their lives to finding them. The silence of the night was not an end, but a pause, and in that pause, the next investigation was already taking shape. The ledger is never empty. The hunt never ends. The shadows are always moving. and the Mossad is always watching.